The morning mist had lingered longer than usual over the rooftops of St. Cedric's, draping its gauzy fingers around chimney pots and ivy-wrapped trellises. Dew clung like tiny crystal beads to rose leaves and spider webs, and the village, though, used to slow awakenings, seemed unusually subdued. A silence hung about the lanes, not of serenity, but of anticipation. Miss Jane Marple stood by the French windows of her sitting room at Dame Mead Cottage, her knitting paused mid-row as she gazed at the street beyond. She wore a pale lavender cardigan, slightly faded at the elbows, and her silver hair was pinned neatly in place. Her needles remained still, her attention caught by something intangible, a mood in the air. Across the road, Mrs. Mallory was sweeping her garden path with brisk, agitated strokes, the kind that signaled something more than mere tidiness. A bird gave a sharp cry above, then flew off toward the vicarage, its wings catching the weak morning. Son, Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. She merely resumed knitting, her fingers moving as rhythmically as a ticking clock. It was the day of the annual spring recital, a modest affair in most eyes, but an St. Cedric's, where little ever disturbed the gentle tides of village life, it was a highlight of the social calendar. Hosted in the vicarage garden by the affable Reverend Pillingford and his overeager wife, the event promised refreshments, floral displays, and, as always, the centerpiece, a solo violin performance by the elusive Irene Cheswick. Miss Marple had never cared much for public gatherings, but she knew from long experience that events such as these often revealed more about people than they intended. So when she donned her straw hat with a black velvet band and stepped out into the gravel lane, it was not for the music, but for the people. By 1 o'clock, the vicarage garden was abuzz with village activity. White bunting flapped lazily overhead, strung between pear trees and old brick pillars. Tables draped in starched linens were heavy with sponge cakes, treacle tarts, and small glass bowls of gooseberry fool. Mrs. Vole was already halfway through her second gin cordial, and was loudly asserting that last year's scones had been too ambitious. "It's not that they were bad, dear," she told Mrs. Bartlett, her voice ringing across the lawn. "It's just that rosemary and lemon don't belong together, not in a scone." Miss Marple sat beneath the wisteria-covered pergola, her shawl folded neatly over her knees. She greeted passers-by with gentle nods, appearing pleasantly detached. In truth, she was already observing Reverend Pillingford's nervous glances toward his wife's floral arrangements, the way Mr. Ellison, the greengrocer, tried not to stare at Miss Thorpe's calves, the careful but chilly exchange between Mrs. Bartlett and Irene Cheswick, who had arrived moments before and stood alone near the rosebeds. Irene Cheswick, as ever, seemed carved from marble. She was a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and graying chestnut hair swept into a low chignon. She wore a silvery shawl over a still blue dress, and she carried her violin case as one might carry a holy relic reverently, but with firm possession. Her expression was unreadable, her gaze distant. She spoke to no one. "She's not quite right, that one," Mrs. Mallory whispered to Miss Marple as she passed by with a plate of buttered crumpets. "Hard to say what goes on behind those eyes." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, tucking away the detail. At precisely 3 o'clock, Irene walked to the performance circle near the old sundial, ignoring the polite smattering of applause. She opened her case, removed the instrument with practiced care, and adjusted the tuning pegs with sharp, angular movements. The crowd hushed. A breeze ruffled the hem of her skirt. Then came the first note. It was low, drawn out, and mournful. Not a familiar piece, at least, not to most ears. The melody meandered without resolution, a winding sequence of minor intervals and long, dissonant chords. It sounded less like a performance and more like a message. Miss Marple tilted her head, slightly listening with more than her ears. A whisper passed through the crowd. "Is that a new composition?" asked Mrs. Bartlett. "No," said Mr. Ellison. I don't know what that is." Irene's bow moved with increasing agitation. Her fingers darted across the fingerboard like they were chasing something, or perhaps being chased. Her body stiffened, the tempo quickened. The notes twisted upward, shrill and erratic. A bird cried out above. Then something changed. A single piercing sound burst forth high, violent, discordant. A screech not quite music, not quite mechanical. It startled everyone. Mrs. Vole dropped her teacup. A child whimpered. The music stopped. Irene Cheswick's bow fell from her hand. Her eyes widened, mouth opened as if to speak, and then she toppled sideways. The violin tumbled with her, striking the ground with a hollow thunk. Her shawl billowed like a wave as she crumpled beside the sundial. For a moment, no one moved. Then the commotion began. Chairs scraped, teacups clattered. Reverend Pillingford rushed forward, knocking over a tray of deviled eggs. Emily Thorpe knelt beside Irene and gasped, "She's not breathing." Constable Finch appeared almost instantly, his young face pale. "Everyone stay back, please. Back from the body." Dr. Allenby, who lived 2 doors down, was fetched in under 5 minutes. He crouched beside Irene, checked her pulse, touched her neck. Then he slowly rose and turned to the crowd. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Dead." A collective gasp. "Heart failure?" offered the vicar, trembling. "Perhaps, but the way she convulsed. It wasn't clean. Could have been. Poisoning, or something neurological. Hard to say without proper tests." Someone muttered, "It was the violin. It screamed." Constable Finch began ushering people back, and within the hour, the garden was sealed off. Inspector Cray arrived from Milchester with 2 constables and an evidence bag. "Odd thing," he muttered to Finch as Miss Marple appeared to busy herself with retrieving a drop ball of yarn nearby. "No obvious injuries. But her fingers, our clenched like claws, might have been strychnine." Miss Marple bent to pick up the yarn, but paused when she spotted something, a thin strand of metal near the violin scroll. A snapped E string. It curled on the ground like a tiny silver snake. She said nothing. By evening, the village buzzed like a disturbed hive. At the Rose and Crown, speculation turned theatrical. "A cursive violin," said Mr. Ellison. "That piece she played it wasn't natural." "It was a warning," said Emily Thorpe. She looked frightened. "I swear she did." "She had enemies," Mrs. Bartlett whispered. "People forget how she and her brother parted. There was a scandal, years ago." At Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sipped her tea in silence. She added a clove to the pot, for clarity. She always said and stared out into the now dark garden. Moonlight silvered the leaves, a cursed violin. Unlikely, but Irene Cheswick had not looked like a woman who was simply overcome with emotion. No, Jane Marple thought as she folded her hands. Someone had planned this. And what was more, they had known the music would cover the sound of a scream. The following morning dawned fair and bright, as though the sky had no memory of the tragedy that had unfolded the previous day. Sunlight streamed through the lattice windows of St. Cedric's homes, warming their stone facades and awakening the robins in the hedgerows. But beneath the brightness, something had shifted. The very air carried a brittle tension, as if the village, so accustomed to its quiet rhythms, now held its breath. At the Blue Teacup, St. Cedric's only tea room and gossip haven, porcelain cups clinked and conversations buzzed in the warm hum of speculation. The lace-curtained windows offered little privacy, and the tables, set neatly with pale blue cloths, were already filled by 10:30. "She dropped like a stone," Mrs. Bartlett was saying to a rapt audience of 3. "Right in front of the sundial, I saw it clearly. One moment she was playing that dreadful piece, and the next bang on. The grass like a felled tree." "It wasn't natural death," declared Mr. Ellison, who had rarely let facts interfere with a good theory. "A violin string doesn't make a noise like that unless it's tampered with." "I say someone engineered it." "Engineered what?" "Precisely?" asked Mrs. Vole, stirring her tea with an air of practiced skepticism. "What, you think she was strangled by the string mid-performance? How dramatic." "She might have been poisoned," offered young Emily Thorpe, her brows drawn together. Irene looked afraid, not ill. "I noticed it. Like she knew something was about to happen." "I saw her hand shaking," Mrs. Bartlett added. "Just before the scream. You mark my words, it was deliberate." Miss Marple sat 2 tables away, sipping her tea with gentle decorum and a placid expression. She was alone, her back straight, a folded newspaper beside her untouched. She did not interrupt, did not even seem to listen, yet her ears registered every word. It was always fascinating how quickly the villagers settled into their roles after a tragedy. There were the dramatists like Mr. Ellison, who constructed elaborate theories within hours. The skeptics like Mrs. Vole, who scoffed but secretly thrilled at the mystery. And then the watchers people like Emily, whose eyes saw more than most, though they didn't yet know how to understand what they observed. Miss Marple, for her part, had no intention of speaking. Not yet. She was still assembling fragments. What disturbed her most wasn't Irene Cheswick's death, it was the manner of it, the suddenness, the shriek that had split the air, a sound that, to anyone else, had seemed like a violin string snapping, But Miss Marple had heard something else. Not louder, not even clearer, just off. Later that day, at the village police station Little. More than a whitewashed building beside the post office, Constable Finch sat stiffly across from Inspector Cray, who had returned that morning from Milchester with a folder under his arm. "No toxicology results yet," Cray said, tapping the folder. "But the county pathologist is examining the body this afternoon. Preliminary look didn't show any marks or punctures. No sign of bruising, and her hands clenched." Finch said, "Yes, clenched, jaw too. Suggests convulsion." Finch hesitated. "Might it have been strychnine, sir? They say that causes, spasms." "It might have," Cray said grimly. "But we've no sign of ingestion. The food at the recital, nothing suspicious. Tea was fine, cake's fine. Everything else was shared." "And the violin?" Finch asked. "Odd thing that," Cray said. "No fingerprints except hers. One string snapped. Could have been tension or wear, but the luthier we consulted said it was in good condition." Cray stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the green. If it was murder, it was planned, calculated, and invisible. Finch cleared his throat. Miss Marple was there. She saw it happen. Cray exhaled slowly. "Yes, she always seems to be where death is." There was no malice in his voice, only wonder. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was walking slowly through the village lanes, a wicker basket on her arm. Her steps took her past the old rectory, down Ivy Lane, and finally to the row of cottages just past the mill stream. She stopped at a small iron gate painted green but chipped with age. The sign read, Cheswick. The house was modest, 2 stories, overgrown with climbing roses, the blinds still drawn. Miss Marple let herself in, noting the padlock on the garden shed and the faint scuff. Marks near the porch. Irene Cheswick had lived alone since her brother's death 15 years prior, and though they had been close once, something had happened. Something dark and quiet that had never been spoken aloud. She did not approach the door, not yet. Instead, she glanced toward the rear of the property, where an old water butt lay overturned and a row of rusted tools leaned against the fence. Among them, an unused music stand poked out from under a canvas tarp. That was odd. Back at Dame Mead Cottage, Miss Marple spent the afternoon going through her notes. Not literal notes, but the mental filing system she had developed over decades of observing human behavior. The villagers spoke of music and madness, of poison and wires, but no one had asked the simplest question: why did Irene play a different piece? She always performed Brahms or Elgar, always. It was not just a habit, it was a ritual. And rituals, Miss Marple knew, were only abandoned under pressure. Was she sending a message, or had someone else chosen that music? That evening, the vicarage doorbell rang just past 7. Mrs. Pillingford opened the door and found Miss Marple standing there, a gentle smile on her face and a tin of shortbread in her hands. "Oh, Miss Marple," the vicar's wife said. Startled but pleased. "Do come in." Inside, the sitting room was still slightly disordered from yesterday's chaos. A teacup remained on the piano. A wilted bouquet of delphiniums slumped in a glass vase. "I wondered," Miss Marple said as she sat, "if you might help me with the curiosity." "Of course." "Who set up Irene Cheswick's seat for?" "The performance?" Mrs. Pillingford blinked. Why, I believe she did herself. She arrived early, refused help as usual, placed her chair just so beside the sundial. And the piece she played, did she mention its name? No. Mrs. Pillingford hesitated. In fact, she seemed different, edgy. She barely spoke to anyone, and she held the violin rather tightly, I thought. I told the Reverend it was nerves, but now I wonder. Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Thank you, dear. That's most helpful." As she stood to leave, she paused by the piano. One of the keys' middle key had a faint smear across it. Not dust, but something darker. She said nothing and left it undisturbed. Outside, the air had turned crisp. Bats flitted through the evening sky, and far off, a clock struck 8. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her expression thoughtful. Something had begun to surface faint outlines of intent beneath layers of confusion. Someone had wanted Irene silent, but what she had tried to say through her music, that was the key. And Miss Marple quietly was beginning to listen. The Cheswick house had always struck the villagers as a place best left undisturbed. Not for any overt reason, it was not decrepit or overgrown, nor had there ever been wild rumors of hauntings or violence. But there was a stillness about it, an unspoken melancholy that made even the most gregarious of neighbors lower their voices when passing by. Irene had lived there alone for over a decade, ever since her brother George perished. In what had been declared an accidental fire, a faulty oil lamp, a locked study door, and a night that left only scorched timber and ashes behind. No one in St. Cedric's had asked too many questions at the time. George Cheswick had not been well liked. He was private, brusque, and, it was whispered, quite clever in unpleasant ways. But now, with Irene's sudden and suspicious death, the shadows of that old tragedy seemed to stir again. Constable Finch stood outside the gate, arms folded, peering up at the darkened upper windows. He had been given quiet orders by Inspector Cray to ensure nothing was touched until the coroner's findings were official. But Miss Marple, walking up the lane with a small basket in her hand, was waved through without hesitation. "Back again?" "Miss Marple?" Finch asked. "Just a few things to return," she said gently. Mrs. Pillingford sent over some sheet music Irene had lent her last year. Thought it best it be placed with her belongings. He nodded, stepping aside, though. His eyes lingered with curiosity. "You don't think it's haunted, do you?" Miss Marple gave a light laugh. "Haunted houses don't scare me, dear. It's the living who have motives." Inside, the air was cool and dry, faintly scented with old paper and rosewood polish. The hallway was narrow, walls lined with framed ink sketches, some musical, others mechanical, blueprints of violins, and cross-sections of tuning mechanisms. Miss Marple walked slowly, her fingertips brushing the edge of a mahogany sideboard, where a single porcelain figurine stood, a woman with a bowed head, playing a violin. She paused, then made her way into the drawing room. The curtains had been pulled shut, casting the room in soft gloom. A writing desk stood near the window, a violin stand leaned in the corner, and beside the fireplace, a modest bookshelf stood filled with music theory, biographies of composers, and 2 volumes titled The Mechanics of Resonance. Miss Marple moved quietly, methodically, setting the basket down and scanning the room with an expression that bordered on fondness. There was little of vanity here. Irene's home was austere, curated, precise like her performances, but not cold. There was a deliberate order that spoke of someone who had needed routine to keep something else at bay. On the desk, a page of handwritten notation lay half-covered beneath an empty envelope. Miss Marple carefully lifted it and read the title, Fantasia in E minor, modified arrangement, G. Cheswick. Her brows rose slightly. It was not Irene's handwriting. That in itself was remarkable. Irene Cheswick had been famously particular. She arranged her own music, corrected editors, even rewrote published work. The thought that she had played someone else's arrangement, her brother's, no less, just before her death, suggested not only a break in character, but possibly a coerced decision. Or a warning. She examined the rest of the desk. A letter. Opener shaped like a swan, an unlit lamp. 2 violin mutes resting atop a folded scarf. A half-empty bottle of ink with a fit crest at the rim, unused recently. And yet, there were signs of haste. A drawer was slightly ajar. The blotter paper on the writing surface had a smudge of fingerprint, perhaps darkened where someone had gripped the edge of the table. One of the small crystal knobs on the drawer was missing, its screw exposed like a button undone too quickly. Miss Marple leaned closer and opened the drawer fully. Inside were envelopes, mostly addressed to music societies and publishers, London Conservatoire, Stroud Music Hall, Music Quarterly Review. Most had not been opened. At the back was a single note, folded neatly in thirds and yellowed with age. She unfolded it. "Irene, if you won't play it, I will. But either way, it will be heard. You owe me that much." Miss Marple stood very still for a moment. Then she carefully returned the note to its place. Later that afternoon, Reverend Pillingford stopped by Dame Mead Cottage under the pretext of returning a borrowed gardening book. In truth, he was pale and anxious, his mouth twitching with unreleased tension. "I had just thought I'd check. How you were, Miss Marple," he said, handing her the Alpine Clematis, growth without fuss. "That's kind of you, Reverend," she replied. "Though I suspect you've more on your mind than florals." The Reverend flushed. "I don't mean to gossip, but something's troubling me about Irene, or rather, about George." "Do sit down," she said kindly. He perched on the edge of the floral armchair. "I'd forgotten until last night George used to compose, did you know? Not just little things. Full scores, and he was obsessive about them. He once argued with the choirmaster about pitch values and refused to set foot in the chapel for weeks. Yes, Miss Marple said. Marple said. I recall hearing of it. Something about a disagreement over key signatures. Precisely, and now? The piece Irene played, Fantasia in E minor. Someone told me it sounded like something he would have written. Moody, mathematical, needlessly. Complex. It was his style. All structure, no soul. Miss Marple nodded, and yet Irene chose it for her final performance. Unless she didn't choose it, the Reverend whispered. They sat in silence a moment. Miss Marple reached for her teacup. George died in a fire. But didn't he lock himself in his study beforehand? Yes, the Reverend said. The door was bolted from the inside. They never quite explained that part. Nor how the oil lamp was knocked over. Miss Marple said nothing. By early evening, the official report arrived at the station. Constable. Finch read it 3 times before passing it to Inspector Cray. No toxins in her system, no punctures, no bruises, and no medical history that would account for the seizure. Cray frowned. So she wasn't poisoned. But something triggered that convulsion. Finch hesitated. What if it wasn't what she ingested, sir? What if it was what she heard? Cray gave him a long look. You think music killed her? Finch flushed. I don't know. But Miss Marple, she asked me something odd. She asked if George Cheswick had ever studied frequency manipulation. Cray blinked. What, sound waves? Finch nodded. Said something about how certain tones at the right pitch, at the right volume, can affect the nervous system. Cray stared at the report again. Then find out everything you can about that violin, he said finally. And where it's been for the last 15 years. That night, Miss Marple sat alone once more, knitting quietly by lamplight. The house was still. Outside, the village was settling down, curtains drawn. Dogs walked, doors locked. She paused and looked out her window. The Cheswick house sat under the moonlight like a sleeping secret. Whatever Irene had played, it had not merely been music. It had been a message. And someone, perhaps someone long thought dead, had ensured it would be heard. Rain came that night, not heavy, but persistent. The kind that hissed gently through hedgerows and soaked into soil without fuss. By morning, St. Cedric's was wrapped in a silver mist, blurring the edges of rooftops and softening the light until everything seemed part of a half-forgotten dream. Yet in the mind of Miss Marple, details were sharpening. She had risen early, as always, and now sat with a second cup of tea at her side, her knitting abandoned in favor of a small cloth-bound notebook she kept in a drawer of her writing desk. On its worn pages, she had begun to sketch what she called her human map, not of locations, but of motives. A quiet exercise, not for police, but for understanding. At the top, she had written 2 names in neat, unhurried script, Irene Cheswick. Deceased George Cheswick, presumed deceased, and beneath them a question. What did the music mean? It was not a rhetorical puzzle, nor a metaphor. Miss Marple knew music could carry meaning, even threat more so when composed by a man. Like George, whose obsession with control and structure, even in sound, had been well known to anyone who remembered him. She had been young when she met him, still sprightly, freshly retired from teaching, and new to the village. George had struck her at once as peculiar. Not eccentric, as so many harmless villagers were, but peculiar, in the way someone might hoard secrets instead of coin. There had been a tension about him that never quite relaxed, and he'd adored his violin more than any person. I don't play with music, he had once said at a village gathering. I play through it. It is a conduit. The purest form of control. The memory now seemed chilling in light of Irene's final performance. By midday, Miss Marple was walking along the cobbled path toward the Milchester Musical Antiquities Center, a small but respected institution just outside the village proper. Its curator, Mr. Edgar Prowse, was a former musician turned musicologist, and his cramped, dusty offices were filled with cabinets of historical instruments, music boxes, cracked tuning forks, and yellowed scores. He greeted Miss Marple warmly, though with some surprise. Miss Marple, it's been a year or more, hasn't it? Come about the flageolet again? Not this time, she smiled. I wonder if I might ask your opinion on a very specific instrument? Or, more precisely, the acoustical properties of one. He gestured toward a creaking leather chair. Sit, sit. I do love a mystery. She handed him a sketch she had made, a rough drawing of a violin, but with several annotated modifications. The placement of the bridge, the angle of the fingerboard, the density of varnish on the body, all based on what she had observed of the G. Cheswick, 1892 violin that now sat in police evidence storage. Mr. Prowse adjusted his spectacles. My word, where did you come across this? In the hands of a very troubled musician, she said quietly. He studied it for a long while. There's something peculiar here. The internal cavity's been slightly expanded, see here and here. That affects resonance. Normally, you'd lose clarity, but this one seems modified to focus the harmonics instead. Meaning what, exactly? He tapped a point near the scroll. This fiddle could, in theory, amplify very specific frequencies, especially those on the high register. You wouldn't notice it in most pieces, but if someone designed a composition to emphasize those frequencies, they could target a listener physically. Miss Marple asked, her voice soft. Mr. Prowse looked startled. Well, theoretically certain frequencies can cause disorientation, anxiety. In rare cases, with prolonged exposure, even convulsions. But that's not music, that's acoustics weaponized. Experimental nonsense? Not nonsense, Miss Marple murmured. Just unfinished business. She stood and thanked him, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender water and a deeply puzzled curator. Back in St. Cedric's, Inspector Cray sat at his desk rereading the coroner's final report. No chemical agent, no external trauma, he muttered. And yet a woman falls to the ground mid-performance, spine arched, muscles rigid. He closed the file and tapped a pencil on the desk. You believe the violin itself was the weapon? He asked Constable Finch, who stood nearby with his notebook in hand. Finch nodded slowly. Miss Marple seems to think the music, not just the instrument, was meant to do something. A specific piece written to affect the body. Cray leaned back in his chair. And you trust her on this? I do, sir, Finch said. Irene never played unfamiliar music. But this Fantasia, well, it wasn't hers. We have handwriting. Samples from Irene, and the arrangement's annotations don't match. We believe it was written by George Cheswick. Possibly just before his death. Cray stared at him. Which occurred how long ago? 15 years. But here's the thing, if he wrote the piece for her and she refused to perform it. Maybe that refusal was the reason he locked himself away and, well, died in a fire, Cray said grimly. So now, years later, she plays it at a public recital? Finch hesitated. What if she was forced to? What if the threat wasn't against her, but against someone else? Cray's brow furrowed. Who? We don't know yet. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor. Emily Thorpe stood nervously at the door of Dame Mead Cottage, clutching a worn brown envelope. I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple, but I found this. It's Irene's. I think she left it at the tea room. Do come in, dear, Miss Marple said, taking the envelope. It was unsealed, but the name on it was clear. To be delivered to Miss Jane Marple, only if I am gone. Inside were several pages letters, mostly written in Irene's small, even handwriting. The final page was a confession of sorts. A recounting of the night George died and of the Fantasia he had demanded she play. He said it would outlive him, that if I wouldn't carry it into the world, it would wait for me. I thought I had buried it with him. But someone found it, someone who knows what it is. I am being watched. If I perform it, the watching may stop. I don't know if it will hurt me. But I do know it was never meant to be heard in public. Miss Marple's lips tightened. She turned the last page over. A single line had been scrawled in unfamiliar, cramped script. The fire was not an accident. You owe me your silence. She folded the paper slowly, her mind whirring. Someone had revived George's obsession, someone who knew the Fantasia, knew its power, and somehow they had forced Irene to comply. But to what end? To make her suffer, or to send a message? The answers, she suspected, still lay within the Cheswick house, but now she knew what to look for. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumnal day when the sun warms the earth but the air holds the promise of frost. St. Cedric's had slipped back into its usual quiet, but beneath the surface, tension stirred like embers in a hearth long thought cold. Miss Marple arrived at the Cheswick house just after 9. The police had reopened the study for a thorough examination, under Inspector Cray's orders. The rest of the house remained sealed, but the study, the room where George Cheswick had died under suspicious circumstances, held the most secrets. Constable Finch met her at the gate, a map of the room in hand, and a look of concern in his eyes. Good morning, Miss Marple. Inspector Cray insisted on us keeping this place under lock and key until we finished here. Thought you might want to see. Thank you, Constable, she said, adjusting her hat. I have no doubt the room will tell us more than anyone expects. The front door creaked open. releasing a faint aroma of charred wood mixed with old paper and dust. The study was narrow but long, lined floor to ceiling with shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes. A mahogany desk sat beneath a window, its surface still scarred by soot and water stains from the original fire. Miss Marple's eyes immediately fell upon a blackened corner of the room where the fire had been most intense. Among the rubble and ash lay fragments of burned sheet music. She crouched and carefully picked one up with a gloved hand. It was brittle and crumbled easily, but a few notes and cryptic annotations remained visible in faded ink. She looked toward Finch. Were these preserved during the initial investigation? Only partially. The fire brigade took what they could, but a lot was destroyed. This is all we have left. Remarkable, Miss Marple murmured. I wonder if this piece was the original Fantasia. Finch nodded. We sent what remains to Milchester for analysis. She ran her fingers along the charred edge of the desk, noticing an indentation, almost like a burn mark left by a hot metal object. Do we know if George was working on something that night? She asked. Finch hesitated. There was talk. He was composing something new, but nothing concrete. No one ever found the manuscript. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. No one except him. The silence between them was broken by the sharp sound of the study door opening. Inspector Cray stepped inside, his usual grim expression deepened. Miss Marple, he greeted. You're just in time. Finch has some new information. Cray moved toward a filing cabinet, pulling out a worn leather-bound notebook. This belonged to George Cheswick. It was recovered from a locked drawer in the study that we hadn't accessed until recently. Inside are his notes on acoustics and sound frequency. Miss Marple took the notebook carefully. The handwriting was neat but obsessive, filled with diagrams and musical notation interspersed with scientific equations. I see he was fascinated by the physical effects of sound waves, she said. Yes, Cray said. He believed certain frequencies could induce physical reactions, dizziness, nausea, even convulsions. Miss Marple flipped a page, stopping at a diagram of a violin's body marked with tiny circles. This explains the modifications we saw in the instrument, she said. He designed it deliberately. Cray nodded. But the question remains, who had access to this knowledge? And more importantly, who had the means to wield it? Miss Marple looked up sharply. And who would want to silence Irene so violently? The team moved to inspect the fireplace more closely. Among the ashes and charred timbers, Finch discovered something unusual. A small metal cylinder, blackened, but intact. What's this? He asked, holding it up to the light. Cray examined it. Looks like a tuning device. A custom-made mute, perhaps. Given the precision of the modifications on the violin, it's possible this was part of George's experiments. Miss Marple reached out and took the cylinder, turning it over in her hands. This could have been used to alter the sound in very specific ways. Exactly, Cray said. Which means whoever had this was well versed in George's work. She rose slowly, tucking the cylinder into a small cloth bag. This is more than a family feud, Miss Marple said quietly. This is a weapon forged from obsession and science. As they continued to sift through the remains, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece, partially obscured by soot. She brushed it clean carefully. It was a portrait of George Cheswick with a younger woman, dark-haired and smiling shyly. Who is this? She asked. Finch checked a ledger nearby. His wife, Eleanor. She left the village shortly after his death. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, and she never returned. Cray frowned. You think she might be relevant? Very much so. There are things hidden in departures, Inspector. People don't just leave without reason. And sometimes the past reaches farther than we expect. After the search concluded, Miss Marple stood once more in the quiet garden, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. Finch and Cray spoke softly near the gate, their voices low. She lingered near the sundial where Irene had fallen, her gaze lingering on the patch of grass still marked by disturbed earth. Something had been played here, something beyond music. Miss Marple thought of the letter Emily Thorpe had brought her, the warning scrawled in desperate ink. The fire was not an accident. Her mind raced through the possibilities. George's death had been no accident. Irene's was no random tragedy. Someone had engineered both, carefully weaving past and present together. And yet, the violin itself, this instrument of delicate wood and taut strings, was the key. A key that unlocked not just sound, but danger. She resolved to look deeper into the Cheswick family's history and to trace Eleanor Cheswick's footsteps. because in the quiet village of St. Cedric's, secrets did not die quietly. They screamed beneath the surface. The village library. On Ivy Lane was a modest building of honey-colored stone, its wooden shelves laden with dusty volumes and yellowed newspapers. It was not often the center of excitement, but today the quiet refuge offered more than the usual rustle of pages. And the occasional cough. Miss Marple entered, her fingers lightly brushing the spines of books as she moved toward the archive room at the back. There, the village historian, Mr. Henry Talbot, awaited her with a warm smile and a neatly organized stack of newspapers and parish records. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I hear the Cheswick mystery is keeping us all on edge," he said, dusting off his spectacles. "It seems the past is refusing to stay buried, Henry," she replied softly, settling at the oak table. "I need to know more about Eleanor Cheswick." Mr. Talbot nodded and spread out several articles from the 1930s and 40s. Eleanor was a local girl, married to George in 32. They were considered an unlikely match. She was lively, social, whereas George was reserved and singular in his passions. Miss Marple scanned the clippings. One was a wedding announcement. Another, a brief social notice mentioning Eleanor's involvement with a local charity. But the most telling was a report from 1947 about Eleanor's sudden departure from the village. "She left rather abruptly," Mr. Talbot said. "No public explanation was ever given. Some whispered of a scandal, others suggested ill health. But her name disappeared from the parish rolls shortly after." "Did George mention her in any of his letters or diaries?" Miss Marple asked. "Very little," Talbot replied. "Their correspondence was mostly business and music. There was a hint of tension, though. Eleanor once wrote to a friend about feeling shut out and unheard." Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward, unheard, like Irene. "Think. You, Henry. This is most helpful." She packed the papers carefully and rose. Outside, the gray sky had begun to thicken. A chill wind stirred the fallen leaves in the lane as she made her way toward the post office, where Mrs. Vole was busy arranging parcels. "Miss Marple," the postmistress greeted with a sharp smile. "I hear you've been poking about in old news. Curious sort, aren't you?" "Curiosity is a friend to those who listen," Miss Marple replied with a twinkle. "Might you know anything about Mrs. Cheswick's departure?" Mrs. Vole pursed her lips, glancing around before whispering, "There were rumors, dear. Quiet ones. I heard from a cousin in Milchester that Eleanor had been seen with a gentleman of rather questionable reputation. Some said she left because of a family dispute. Others suggested something more dangerous." "Dangerous?" Miss Marple pressed. Mrs. Vole shrugged. "You know how village talk can twist. But it involved a man who dealt in rare instruments and had a shadowy past. George didn't like him, that's for sure." Miss Marple tucked the new piece of information into her mental file. "Thank you, Mrs. Vole. Sometimes the smallest details hold the greatest truths." That afternoon, the church bells tolled as Miss Marple found herself at the village archives, a small glass-fronted building behind St. Cedric's Church. There, she hoped to uncover more about this mysterious man whom the villagers only referred to as Mr. Fenwick. She sifted through parish records, old letters, and a few scattered legal documents. Among them was a faded contract between George Cheswick and a Mr. Jonathan Fenwick, dated just months before George's death. It detailed the sale and modification of a rare violin. The document hinted at a partnership, one that had gone sour. Miss Marple read the contract carefully. "Jonathan Fenwick shall provide all necessary modifications and experimental apparatus for the instrument in question. George Cheswick reserves the right to approve or reject any changes." Beneath it, a handwritten note, probably in George's hand. "Fenwick's ambition outpaces his discretion. Caution advised." Miss Marple's fingers traced the ink. Who was Jonathan Fenwick? And what had happened to him after George's death? Evening came with a cold drizzle, and Mead Cottage felt snug in comparison to the gathering gloom. Miss Marple sat before the fire, leafing through a village directory. She had borrowed from the post office. Fenwick was listed as having once lived in Milchester, but the entry was crossed out in red ink, a date scribbled beside it. "Left under a cloud," Miss Marple murmured. She rose and moved to the window, peering out at the damp streets. The village seemed peaceful, but beneath the surface, histories tangled like ivy on brickwork. A soft knock at the door startled her. It was Emily Thorpe again, holding a bundle of papers. "I thought you might want to see these," she said, breathless. Miss Marple accepted the papers, recognizing them immediately as excerpts from a local newspaper society column. They mention a Mr. Fenwick, Emily said. Said he was a brilliant but dangerous man. He dealt in antique instruments and had a reputation for gambling debts and less than legal dealings. Miss Marple nodded. Dangerous indeed. It appears. Our mystery deepens. Emily hesitated. Do you think he could have come back to St. Cedric's? Very possibly, dear. And if so, he might hold the key to why Irene had to play that dreadful fantasia. The next day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Milchester's town records office. There, after a patient search through dusty ledgers and faded photographs, she found what she was looking for, a brief arrest record for Jonathan Fenwick. He had been detained 5 years prior for illegal importation of rare instruments and forgery. He'd served a short sentence but vanished afterward with no known address. Miss Marple took careful note. Back in St. Cedric's, as dusk settled, the village pub, the Red Lion, was buzzing with tentative whispers. News of the investigation's slow progress had reached every ear, mingling with speculation. Miss Marple listened quietly from a corner, observing faces twisted with curiosity, fear, and the faintest touch of guilt. Among them was a man. She had not yet spoken to Mr. Philip Dane, the village antiques dealer. His gaze flickered nervously whenever Irene's name was mentioned. After a while, Miss Marple approached him. Mr. Dane, she said softly, may I have a word? He looked up, startled, then nodded. Did you know Jonathan Fenwick? She asked. His jaw tightened. I knew of him. Dangerous man, as the stories say. But I have nothing to do with whatever's troubling this village now. Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes, Mr. Dane, it's what we don't say that tells the loudest stories. He swallowed hard and glanced away. That night, back at Mead Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, threading together the threads she had gathered. A man with a shadowed past, a violin engineered to harm, a family torn apart by obsession, and a woman silenced before she could speak. The echoes from the past were growing louder, and Miss Marple knew that to uncover the truth, she must listen carefully to every whisper, every note left unfinished. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, with frost dusting the hedgerows and a sharp wind sweeping through the lanes of St. Cedric's. Miss Marple, fortified by her usual weak tea and a warm wool shawl, set out with a firm purpose in mind. There were questions needing answers, and one man, Mr. Philip Dane, had offered far more with his silence than his words. She arrived at Dane Antiques shortly after 10. The shop front was an orderly jumble of mahogany chairs, pewter teapots, and glass-domed clocks. A little bell jingled as she stepped inside, the warmth and scent of oiled wood enveloping her. Philip Dane was behind the counter, hunched over a ledger, but he straightened quickly upon seeing her. Miss Marple, he said, with a carefully practiced smile. Didn't expect to see you so early. I find the mind is sharpest before lunch, she replied, her voice mild. Especially when one is troubled by inconsistencies. Dane's eyes flickered. Inconsistencies. I've been thinking about George Cheswick and his violin, she continued. And of course, about Jonathan Fenwick. Philip turned toward the counter, fiddling unnecessarily with a set of ivory-handled letter openers. I told you I never dealt with Fenwick. No, you said you had nothing to do with what's troubling the village now, Miss Marple said gently, a clever phrasing. But clever phrasing often hides foolish secrets. Philip's hand stilled. What are you implying? That you might know more about the violin than you let on, she said calmly. Perhaps you were involved in its appraisal or handling. Perhaps George consulted you before making alterations. He hesitated, then exhaled heavily and leaned back against the counter. All right, he muttered. Yes, I handled the violin once years ago. George brought it to me, wanted my opinion on its value. He didn't tell me he was working with Fenwick, but I suspected it. Miss Marple waited patiently. It was a curious instrument, he continued. French, late 19th century. Beautiful. Craftsmanship, but odd. There were internal modifications. Tiny brass rods near the sound post, a strange cavity near the tailpiece. Unnatural resonances. Was it dangerous, she asked. Philip looked up. I'm no physicist, but it gave off a resonance that made my ears ring, and it wasn't pleasant. When played hard, especially at high frequencies, it produced a vibration. You could feel it in your bones. Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly, rather like a scream. He nodded slowly. Exactly. I told George to be careful. He brushed it off, said it was part of his research into acoustical phenomena, but that was the last time I saw the violin. Until Irene played it. He glanced away. She didn't know, he said quietly. I saw her before the recital, and I could tell she was tense, pale even. I should have said something, but you didn't, Miss Marple said gently. Because guilt is uncomfortable and silence feels easier. Philip said nothing more, and Miss Marple didn't press. She had what she needed. By midday, the sky had grown clouded and heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple stopped in at the local tea room, where she found Reverend Simmons deep in conversation with Mrs. Larch, the vicar's wife. They made room at the table, and soon talk turned, as it always did of late, to Irene's funeral and the strange circumstances surrounding her death. She was so talented, Mrs. Larch said, stirring her tea. I used to hear her practicing from my garden. That violin of hers, it had such an eerie tone sometimes. I thought perhaps it was the piece she was working on. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Was she often alone in the church when she practiced? Oh yes, the Reverend said. She liked the acoustics in the sanctuary, said it helped her focus. She had permission to use it when she wished. And she played George Cheswick's Fantasia during those sessions. Almost obsessively, from what I gathered, Mrs. Larch said. She mentioned once that it made her feel transported. I remember the word precisely. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable, transported or disturbed. Did she ever complain of feeling unwell afterward? She asked quietly. The Reverend and his wife exchanged glances. There were times she looked quite drained, Mrs. Larch admitted. Like something had been taken out of her. I assumed it was artistic intensity. Some musicians are sensitive to emotional expression. Miss Marple set down her teacup with delicate precision. Or to the instruments they play, she murmured. That afternoon, she paid a quiet visit to the Cheswick cottage. A thick silence had settled over the house. Mrs. Jerning, the housekeeper, answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and a handkerchief clutched in one hand. Forgive me, Miss Marple, she said, sniffing. It's all so strange. I keep expecting Irene to come down the stairs asking for tea. I know, Miss Marple said softly. Might I come in for a moment? They sat in the drawing room, where Irene's violin still rested on its stand, its strings silent. Miss Marple gestured toward it. May I? Mrs. Jerning nodded. She approached the instrument and bent close, peering at the body and chin. Rest the faint dust in the scroll. The modifications were nearly invisible, but there was a fine line of seam along the ribs, something no ordinary violin would display. Did Irene ever mention where she found the sheet music for George's Fantasia? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Jerning frowned. No. But I remember the day she brought it home. She was elated. Said she found it hidden in an old case in the loft behind some shelves. She thought it was a lost masterpiece. Hidden? Miss Marple repeated. Did she say who might have put it there? She assumed it was George's, of course. She believed it was his final composition. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, thoughts aligning. A piece of music no one had ever heard before. An instrument modified by a dangerous man. A woman found dead after performing both, and a past that was never fully buried. That evening, back in her parlor, Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her knitting in her lap, but the needles unmoving. The pieces were there scattered like broken notes in a melody gone wrong. George Cheswick had worked with Jonathan Fenwick to create a violin capable of extraordinary, perhaps even dangerous, sound. The Fantasia had never been performed publicly, and now Miss Marple wondered if that had been deliberate. Perhaps George had realized too late what he'd constructed a composition that, when played on that particular instrument, unleashed something too powerful for the human mind to bear. And yet someone had deliberately left that music for Irene to find, not misplaced hidden. Which meant it was no accident she found it, no accident she played it, no accident she died. The faint chime of the village clock marked the hour. Miss Marple rose slowly and turned down the lamp. Tomorrow, she would begin asking very different questions. The morning was sullen and gray when Miss Marple returned to the Cheswick cottage. Low-hanging clouds loomed over the rooftops of St. Cedric's, and a cold drizzle made the cobbled lane slick underfoot. Her umbrella was more of a prop than a shield. It gave her dignity, but little protection from the wet. Still, her step was purposeful, her gaze steady. Mrs. Jerning answered the door again, looking wan but composed. Back again, Miss Marple? If you don't mind terribly, I'd like to see the loft where Irene found the music, Miss Marple said gently. I believe it may help clarify some questions I've been pondering. The housekeeper hesitated, her hands wringing her apron unconsciously. Well, it's just an old storage space, but yes, this way. They climbed the narrow staircase, past framed watercolors of St. Ives and Stratford, until they reached the landing. A wooden door, low and unassuming, stood at the far end. Mrs. Durning reached above the frame and retrieved a key from a hook, then unlocked it. The loft smelled of old paper and cedar. A single dormer window let in a slant of pale light that illuminated trunks, hat boxes, and old furniture stacked in silent formation. Dust floated like motes of memory in the beam. Mind the step, Mrs. Durning said as Miss Marple stooped to enter. She told me she'd found the manuscript in that old violin case behind the armoire. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning. The armoire was a great dark thing, its legs cracked with age. Behind it, as described, was a battered leather violin case, its latches rusted. Miss Marple knelt and opened it, empty. She examined the interior. There were faint impressions on the velvet, where something had rested for a long time. Curiously, there were 2 outlines, one for a violin and a slightly flatter shape next to it. Sheet music, perhaps? A cloth bundle? Did George ever mention hiding things up here? She asked. Mrs. Durning frowned. Not to me. But he was a secretive man, and after his breakdown, well, he wasn't himself. He once told Irene that music could outlive sanity. I didn't understand it at the time. Miss Marple brushed her gloved hand gently along the back of the case. Her fingers caught on something, a small tear in the lining. She leaned closer. Inside, folded tightly and almost invisible, was a slip of paper. She opened it. It was a fragment of musical notation. Not a full bar, just to phrase 5 discordant notes scrawled in black ink. With 2 letters above, J.F. Jonathan Fenwick, Miss Marple murmured. Irene must have missed that when she found the Fantasia. She added aloud, more to herself. Then to Mrs. Durning. But what did it mean? A code? A signature? Or a warning? She folded the paper and placed it in her handbag. A growing unease stirred in her chest, something both dread and certainty. George Cheswick's so-called breakdown. The abandoned violin. The hidden music. And now this Fenwick signature left like a stain. Thank you, Mrs. Durning. This has been most helpful. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called on Inspector Bullfinch at the station. The inspector, a tidy man with a distrust of amateur detection, greeted her with cautious politeness. I expect you've come with another angle on our musical mystery, Miss Marple. She smiled. Just a few thoughts I'd like to share unofficially, of course. He sighed. Go on. She recounted her visit to the loft, the hidden violin case, and the slip of paper bearing Fenwick's initials. Bullfinch frowned and leaned back in his chair. I've read the file on Fenwick. Highly intelligent, but unstable toward the end, obsessed with acoustics and their effect on the human body. There was talk unsubstantiated that he'd begun testing infrasonic frequencies in his later compositions. And could such frequencies harm someone? She asked delicately. Possibly, in theory, yes. There's medical literature about exposure causing anxiety, hallucinations, even internal distress. But proving a direct connection would be difficult, unless someone deliberately created an instrument and composition to produce exactly that effect. Bullfinch blinked. You think Irene was killed by music? I think Irene was. Used by someone who understood how dangerous that music was, Miss Marple said softly. She trusted the Fantasia because she believed it was George's lost work. But what if someone knew it was never meant to be performed and left it where she would find it, knowing what would happen? Bullfinch looked at her gravely. You're suggesting murder, premeditated, or at the very least, reckless endangerment with intent? She nodded. And we must ask ourselves, who benefits from Irene's death? That question hung over Miss Marple as she walked home through the Ville. Damp lanes. She passed the bakery, where 2 ladies clutched warm paper bags and whispered with animated faces. Near the church, children were skipping rope while their governess looked on distractedly. The life of the village had resumed, but uneasily, like an orchestra waiting for a conductor's cue. At home, she brewed a cup of tea and reviewed her notes. There were the obvious players, Philip Dane, who had handled the violin and knew its dangers. Edmund Carlyle, whose proximity to Irene had become a subject of gossip and speculation. Eleanor Marston, who harbored a quiet jealousy and had not shed a tear since the tragedy. But who had access to both the violin and the loft? Who had the knowledge to exploit Fenwick's dangerous design and the malice to let someone else suffer the consequences? Her mind turned again to Edmund. He had been evasive about his relationship with Irene. His piano accompaniment placed him in direct connection to her musical performances. And he had, rather oddly, insisted on keeping George's original composition library, even after Irene's death. She remembered what Eleanor had said. He's not half as calm as he pretends. Could Edmund have found the fantasia, or even composed it from Fenwick's drafts, and planted it for Irene? But why? To silence her? To test it? Or perhaps to relive something once shared with George? Miss Marple tapped her teacup lightly. There was only one way to know. That evening, under the pretense of a friendly call, she visited Edmund Carlyle at the vicarage in X. He answered the door himself, his hands ink-stained and his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, what a surprise." "I hope I'm not intruding," she said cheerfully. "Only I remembered that you mentioned having some of George's early manuscripts, and I wondered if I might see them." His smile stiffened. "Of course, though I doubt they'd mean much to someone not musically inclined." "Oh, I'm dreadfully ignorant," she said, stepping inside. "But sometimes I find even the look of handwriting quite telling." His study was cluttered with musical scores, stacked books, and loose manuscripts. He gestured toward a shelf and excused himself to fetch coffee. Miss Marple moved quickly. She examined the sheets. Most were harmless sonatas, sketches, trios. But one folder at the back caught her eye. The label was faded, but inside were pages covered in a different hand-sharper slanted. The initials JF recurred again and again. She didn't touch them, only looked. A fragment on the top page matched the one she had found in the loft. So Edmund had access to Fenwick's notes. She stepped back just as he returned with a tray. "I do thank you," she said with a warm smile. "It's a comfort to know George's work is in such careful hands." He inclined his head. "It's the least I can do." As she left, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the grand piano by the window. The lid was closed. But there, resting beside it, was a tuning fork, large, steel, slightly scorched at the tip. A musician's tool or something more sinister? The following morning brought with it a brittle wind and the sharp scent of turned earth, as if the village of St. Cedric's were bracing itself for revelations it had long buried. Miss Marple, however, remained her usual composed self as she took tea in the rose-patterned sitting-room of the vicarage. Opposite the vicar's wife, Mrs. Graham, a delicate woman with twitching fingers and the weary smile of someone accustomed to bearing many confidences. The vicar himself was out delivering communion to the infirm, and it had given Miss Marple the perfect excuse to pay a casual social call. She wasn't there for piety, but for pianissimo. "You know, Mrs. Graham," Miss Marple said gently, stirring her tea with the practiced grace of a woman who never spilled a drop. "I was rather struck by Mr. Carlyle's playing the other day. So controlled. But there's something more, something behind it, a kind of restraint." Mrs. Graham, caught mid-sip, raised an eyebrow. "He is a precise player. He practices in the evenings, never when the sun's out, curiously, always with the curtains drawn. Sensitive ears, perhaps," Miss Marple mused. "Or a sensitive conscience?" The vicar's wife gave a small laugh, uncertain whether a joke had been made. Miss Marple pressed on with a kindly expression. "I wonder, have you ever heard him play anything unusual? Something not quite classical?" Mrs. Graham hesitated. "Well, not exactly. But once I shouldn't gossip, I passed his room last week and heard the most dreadful sound. Not music at all, a low humming, like the floorboards were vibrating. I thought at first it was a problem with the plumbing." "Low humming, you say?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened ever so slightly. "Almost made me dizzy," the vicar's wife added. "But by the time I returned with a cup of broth, it had stopped." "He was playing Chopin then, as though nothing had happened." Miss Marple filed the detail away. "Vibration, dizziness, disorientation. These effects matched the reports she'd read on low-frequency sound. If Edmund Carlyle had been experimenting with such techniques, the piano might well be the accomplice, silent, polished, and complicit." After tea, she walked down to the green and sat on a bench opposite the churchyard, opening a worn book in her lap. She wasn't reading, she was watching. From the annex, Edmund emerged precisely at 4:30. his arms full of sheet music, headed toward the music room of the village hall. Eleanor Marston joined him a few minutes later, looking unusually solemn in a navy coat, her eyes shaded behind dark glasses despite the cloudy sky. Eleanor and Edmund again. There was something about their closeness that had shifted. It was no longer flirtatious nor casual. It was careful, intentional. Miss Marple rose from her bench and took a slow route toward the hall, stopping by the bakery for a small scone and making polite conversation with Mrs. Latchcombe, who spoke far too freely about how oddly intense young Carlyle had become. He shut himself in there for hours, Mrs. Latchcombe said, nodding toward the hall. Yesterday, I heard a strange tone coming from the building, almost like a bee trapped in a bottle. Nobody else seemed to notice. Miss Marple's fingers twitched. Inside the hall, she found the door ajar. Music drifted from within a delicate run of arpeggios. She stepped inside quietly. Edmund was at the grand piano, his back to her. Eleanor sat beside the music stand, her expression flat. When Miss Marple entered fully, both turned, Edmund startled, Eleanor merely watchful. Miss Marple, he said, rising. Forgive me, we didn't expect visitors. Oh, do forgive the intrusion. I do so love a bit of live music. I was passing and thought how lucky I am to catch you. She moved toward the piano slowly, her eyes taking in the room. Atop the instrument, a small electronic tuner sat beside a peculiar metal device long, cylindrical, humming faintly even though it appeared unconnected to anything. She glanced at Edmund, who moved quickly to cover it with a cloth. Just part of the tuning process. Of course, she said sweetly. May I ask what you were playing? A nocturne I've been working on, he replied stiffly. Nothing finished, just exploration. Eleanor spoke up suddenly. Edmund's been writing again. Inspired by George's notebooks? Indeed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And did George's notes include unusual techniques? Edmund's expression darkened. Music is meant to push boundaries. Sometimes boundaries are there for safety, Miss Marple said mildly, adjusting her shawl. I once knew a woman who tried to make a soup out of daffodil bulbs, thought she was being clever. It did not end well. Neither smiled. She turned toward the instrument, running her fingers lightly along the polished surface. You know, she said gently, I always found it curious that Irene's death occurred during a rehearsal, not a performance. No audience. No applause, just her and the music. And me, Edmund added coldly. Yes, Miss Marple said with softness, just you. The silence stretched. Eleanor rose. I think this has gone far enough. Oh, I quite agree, Miss Marple said, with sudden steel in her voice. I believe this little composition has reached its crescendo. She turned to Edmund. You gave her the music, didn't you? Knew it would unsettle her. Perhaps not kill, but you hoped, deep down, it might. All those years watching her succeed while you stood in the shadows of greater men, George, then Fenwick, then Irene. Edmund's jaw twitched. She was using George's name to launch her next album? Eleanor snapped, stepping forward. She didn't even care about him. She only cared about the story, and Edmund, he brought her real music. Something George never dared. But she didn't think him, Miss Marple said quietly. She was frightened. She didn't understand what you had created. And so she told you to stop? Edmund's face had gone pale. I didn't mean, he broke off. It was an experiment. I warned her. I said it wasn't ready. But you watched her play it, Miss Marple said gently. You knew the moment her bow struck that first phrase how it would take hold. How the frequency would build, pressure behind her eyes. You knew, and you stayed silent. I loved her, he said weakly. I wanted her to feel something true. She felt fear, Miss Marple said. And you stood behind the curtain and listened. The silence now was crushing. Eleanor spoke again, quietly. You can't prove any of this. Miss Marple offered a smile that was neither cruel nor kind. I don't need to. I only need to understand it. The inspector, on the other hand, will want that tuning fork. And the notes marked JF and the recordings I suspect you've made. She turned away, her heart heavy. In her bag was the final piece, Fenwick's letter to George, found in the lining of the violin case, begging him never to perform the Fantasia. It was not written for ears, Fenwick had warned. Only for silence. But Irene had not heeded that silence. And now, the piano Edmund's silent accomplice had spoken. It was not in Miss Marple's nature to confront a matter directly at least not before she had finished her knitting and drawn her own conclusions. Yet when she left the village hall that afternoon, there was a tightness about her mouth and a swift purpose in her step that the villagers would not have missed. Had any been watching, she did not return home immediately. Instead, she made her way to the Laurels, where Inspector Cray stood in the drawing room with Dr. Bellamy and a constable, examining the curious device Miss Marple had retrieved from the music room piano. It's a modified infrasound emitter, the inspector said, eyebrows drawn. Industrial design, likely custom built. Wouldn't be out of place in acoustic engineering labs. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Curious, isn't it, that it was hidden among sheet music? And even more curious, added Dr. Bellamy, examining the tuner, that it was set at an amplitude known to cause nausea, anxiety, and, in some cases, auditory hallucinations. Or, Miss Marple said softly, a sense that the violin itself was screaming. The phrase hung in the air. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. You're saying this machine, this sound, was responsible for Irene's collapse? I suspect it acted as a trigger, Miss Marple said, folding her hands. You see, I've come to believe that Irene, though strong in will, was deeply susceptible to suggestion. Imagine performing a new composition written by your late partner's rival while standing in the very hall where your fiancé died. Add to that a frequency she could not consciously detect, but which manipulated her physiology. She trailed off. Dr. Bellamy looked troubled. It wouldn't be enough to kill a healthy woman. But Irene wasn't healthy, Miss Marple replied. Or rather, she believed she wasn't. That is just as dangerous. Especially when you know which chord will shake her nerves, which vibration will mimic a panic attack, and when to play it. Cray glanced toward the doorway. And you believe Edmund Carlyle knew all this? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she removed a folded sheet of parchment from her handbag. This is Fenwick's letter to George Faulkner, written in the early 60s and hidden in the lining of the violin case. Cray read aloud, to play the fantasia is to awaken something not meant to be heard. I composed it not in sound, but in silence. George, you must never allow it to be performed, particularly not by someone who does not know the danger within. He looked up, a dramatic turn of phrase. Fenwick was a man of extremes, Miss Marple said, but he was not delusional. He had been experimenting with sonic effects long before it became fashionable in modern composition. His fantasia, in D minor, was a calculated arrangement of tones designed to test human endurance. He shelved it after an incident during rehearsal left a singer temporarily deaf. Dr. Bellamy was already scribbling in his notebook. But why give it to George? George was obsessed with the idea of sound as emotion. He believed music could bypass the intellect, entirely strike directly at the soul. And Carlyle? Edmund, Miss Marple said softly, was present for that rehearsal in 1967. He was only a student, but he never forgot what he heard. When he found George's notebooks after his death, he saw an opportunity to make something powerful, to prove that he, not George, had mastered the craft. The inspector leaned back, so he replicated the effects. But if Irene's death wasn't deliberate, it may not have begun as deliberate, Miss Marple said, but when he saw what the music could do to her, when she refused to credit him for it, when she mocked the piece as unplayable nonsense, I believe resentment tipped into action. Cray drummed his fingers on the table. You've no shortage of motive and theory, Miss Marple, but what we need is evidence. Oh, but we have it, Miss Marple said, rising with surprising grace. We simply haven't been listening closely enough. The following day, the townspeople gathered once again in the music hall, not for a performance, but for an inquest. A large phonograph had been wheeled into the center of the room, its stylus hovering over a wax recording. Miss Marple stood quietly near the rear as Inspector Cray addressed the room. We are about to hear a recording made by Irene Marston 3 days before her death. A private rehearsal discovered among her belongings and confirmed by her housekeeper, Mrs. Shale. He gestured toward the constable, who dropped the stylus. At first, there was only static. Then a violin's tentative note, followed by silence. Then a series of piercing, dissonant tones. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Several people clutched their coats. The tones deepened. A slow, pulsing undercurrent began barely audible, but unsettling. Miss Marple watched the crowd carefully. Most showed confusion, a few discomfort, but only one man, Edmund Carlyle, showed recognition. His hand twitched, his eyes fixed to the ground. He was not listening, he was reliving. Miss Marple stepped forward. Mr. Carlyle, may I ask, did you intend for Irene to hear this version? This version? Edmund lifted his head slowly. She asked for it. She wanted something bold, but you didn't warn her what it could do. It's just music, he snapped. She was the one who dramatized everything, George too. Always. Chasing phantoms. Then you deny modifying the composition to include the infrasound element? He laughed bitterly. There's no proof of that. Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. No, but the piano does. Dr. Bellamy found microscopic warping in the wood exactly where the emitter was placed. The frequency etched itself into the very structure of the instrument. The grain sings, Mr. Carlyle, whether you like it or not. Gasps echoed. Edmund turned pale. Cray stepped forward. We will be conducting a full forensic examination of the device and the piano. In the meantime, you are not to leave the village. Edmund sank into his seat, eyes hollow. The phonograph hissed into silence. Later, as twilight fell over the village and the music hall emptied, Miss Marple stood alone before the grand piano. She reached out and touched the keys, not to play, but to feel. There was a vibration beneath her fingertips, a faint memory of sound. It's strange, she said aloud, though no one was near, how often it is the quiet things that hurt. Most. The door behind her creaked. Eleanor Marston stepped in, her expression unreadable. I wanted to say thank you, she said, voice soft. Miss Marple regarded her gently. You knew, didn't you? Or at least, suspected. I saw him adjusting something under the piano 2 nights before Irene died. But he said it was a tuner. I didn't know about the rest until yesterday. And then I couldn't decide what was worse, the truth or the silence. The truth, Miss Marple said kindly, may bruise, but silence corrodes. Eleanor turned away, tears in her eyes. Miss Marple did not follow. She sat instead at the edge of the bench and looked once more at the keys. Some melodies, she thought, should remain unplayed. The following morning dawned with a hush over St. Petro's. The market stalls, usually bustling by 9:30, were slow to open. Doors were half shut, curtains only partially drawn back. In the King's Plough, even the clinking of teacups was muted, as if the entire village were waiting for something, though no one could say quite what. At the corner table by the window, Miss Marple stirred her tea without drinking it. Her mind was elsewhere, though her blue eyes flicked idly across the street. She'd already observed 3 things that morning. First, Edmund Carlyle had not returned to his cottage, though the constable posted outside confirmed he had been allowed to sleep at the station under voluntary hold. Second, Eleanor Marston had walked the entire length of the high street twice, but hadn't gone inside a single shop. And third, Miss Letitia Vane had cancelled her weekly knitting circle at the church hall for the first time in 15 years. The air was charged. Something had changed since the phonograph incident, though not everyone was prepared to admit it aloud. More tea, Miss Marple? Asked Meg, the cafe waitress, her apron wrinkled and her usual cheer absent. No, thank you, dear, Miss Marple replied. Although, if you have any of that lovely gingerbread left, it might be just the thing. Meg brightened, a flicker of routine soothing her. Of course, just baked this morning. Miss Marple watched her go, then gently tapped the teaspoon against her saucer. The sound rang sharp, much sharper than the acoustics of the King's Plough typically allowed. Interesting, she thought. Moments later, the door opened with a gust of cool air and a rustle of papers. Inspector Cray entered, looking rumpled and unusually flustered. I've been hunting for you, he said, joining her without invitation. We've had a development. Miss Marple gave him a calm, expectant look. Do go on, Inspector. I hope it isn't another ghost, Cray exhaled. It's a message. From an old music student of George Faulkner's Nigel Shaw. He's in Bath now, teaches theory. Claims he received a letter from George shortly before the man's death. Didn't open it until yesterday, of all things. Claims it mentions the violence buried in the Fantasia. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did he bring the letter? Cray nodded. It's authentic, far as we can tell. George was warning him never to attempt to decode the final bars. He believed someone else had already done so. And this is the part I think you'll find most interesting. He refers to that person only as E. E, Miss Marple said softly. Not a difficult cipher. No, Cray agreed. Carlyle's first initial, but here's where things shift again. Carlyle maintains he never read George's letters. He claims they were locked in a bureau and that he only found them after Irene's death. He says he skimmed them out of grief, not intention. Miss Marple gave a little nod. And you believe him? Cray hesitated. I'm not sure. But here's what I do know. Carlyle didn't have the technical knowledge to build the infrasound emitter. We've had our engineers examine it. It's far beyond a composer's capacity, especially one working primarily in analog. Which begs the question, Miss Marple murmured. Who built it? The inspector leaned in. Exactly. And there's one person who did have the skill and the motive. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Dr. Bellamy? Cray gave a dry chuckle. You're always ahead of me. Miss Marple picked up her tea at last. Not ahead, Inspector. Just listening more closely. By early afternoon, she found herself outside Dr. Bellamy's practice, her gloved hands folded neatly. In front of her, the brass plaque still gleamed beside the green-painted door, but the curtains were drawn tight across the surgery windows. The front step had been swept recently. Miss Marple noticed the distinct drag marks of a straw broom, but no patients appeared to be waiting. She knocked gently. A pause. Then the door opened, and Dr. Bellamy stood in the frame, his coat half-buttoned, and his spectacles fogged. Miss Marple. I didn't expect visitors. Few expect me when I arrive, she said with a soft smile. But I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I've had the most curious thoughts about vibrations, frequency, and human fragility. He stepped aside, hesitant. Well, come in then. His consulting room was as she remembered clocks. Ticking, the faint scent of lavender antiseptic, and tidy shelves stacked with folders arranged alphabetically. I believe you once studied acoustic trauma, she said, settling into the armchair. During your training in Edinburgh? Bellamy stiffened. Years ago, yes. A minor research module. You published a paper, did you not? About sonic disorientation in naval officers? He stared. That was a decade past. I barely recall it. But someone else might, she said, her eyes twinkling. Someone who needed help engineering a device that could produce just the right kind of disorientation. Someone like Edmund Carlyle. Bellamy's lips tightened. This is speculation, is it? Or is it curiosity piqued by your extraordinary calm throughout these events? I'm a doctor. I must be calm. But you're not cold. And I just think that you found yourself in over your head. That perhaps you meant no harm at first. Perhaps you believed Carlyle's interest in Fenwick's frequencies was merely theoretical. But when Irene Marston collapsed during rehearsal, you realized what had been done. He was silent. Miss Marple continued gently. You see, I know what it is to be underestimated. Carlyle is a proud man. A man who needed to succeed. He couldn't have built such a device alone. But he could have manipulated someone clever enough to design it. You have no proof, Bellamy said at last, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. I do not seek proof today, only understanding. As she left, she paused by the mantelpiece, where a photograph of Bellamy's father in naval uniform sat in a frame. Fragility, she thought. Even the strongest structures have their breaking point. Later that evening, the village's hush had begun to unravel. The music hall committee was meeting again, determined to resume programming by week's end. At the vicarage, Rev. Wells had opened his garden for evening tea, as if to reassure everyone that life could still proceed. Even Letitia Vane had been spotted purchasing pastries from the bakery, a sign, surely, that the world was mending. But the heart of the mystery had yet to reveal itself. In her parlor, Miss Marple sat by the window listening. Not to the birds, or the ticking clock, but to the gaps between sounds. It was in those spaces, those silences, that truth often lived. Her mind ticked back over every conversation, every reaction, every note of the fantasia. Someone in St. Petro's had known what the music would do. Someone who had stood to benefit not merely from Irene's collapse, but from its symbolic impact. From the fear it evoked. From the power of that scream no one heard, but everyone felt. She glanced toward her knitting basket, where a single thread of red wool lay tangled. There's always a thread, she said quietly. It's simply a matter of knowing where to pull. The day began with an early, persistent drizzle that soaked the cobblestones of St. Petro's and blurred the edges of the village green. Miss Marple, undeterred, took her usual morning walk along the lane that led past the churchyard and the old mill pond. She was wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, the damp air filling her lungs with a sharp freshness that only seemed to sharpen her thoughts. The village was quieter than usual. Shutters remained closed on some cottages, and the usual hum of gossip seemed subdued. The weight of recent events still lingered like an unwelcome fog. As she passed the bakery, she noticed Letitia Vane standing beneath the awning, her face pale and drawn. The widow's knitting needles paused mid-air, a thin thread slipping from her grasp. "Good morning, Miss Vane," Miss Marple called softly. Letitia looked up, startled, then managed a faint smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, good morning. I just resting my hands." "They've been so very cold." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Cold hands often tell more than words. Might I walk with you for a moment?" Letitia hesitated, then nodded. Together, they strolled toward the village green, the sound of their footsteps muted by the rain. "I wonder, Miss Vane," Miss Marple began, "have you noticed anything unusual among the villagers lately? Any whispers or movements that seem out of place?" Letitia's eyes darted nervously. "There's always gossip, dear, but nothing I can put my finger on, except Edmund Carlyle. He's been restless, more than ever. And Eleanor Marston has taken to walking late at night, alone." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed. And have you seen anything peculiar during those walks?" The widow's hands trembled as she twisted a loose strand of yarn. "No, nothing that I can say aloud. But I overheard something at the market yesterday. A voice, low and angry, speaking of debts and betrayals." "Debts and betrayals," Miss Marple repeated, her mind ticking over the implications. "Do you think it could be connected to the violin and the fantasia?" Letitia asked, lowering her voice. "Everything in St. Petro's seems connected these days," Miss Marple answered, her eyes scanning the misty horizon. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple laid out the tangled threads of her investigation as if they were skeins of yarn needing careful untangling. The correspondence from Nigel Shaw, the strange device hidden beneath the piano, the fractured relationships between George Faulkner, Edmund Carlyle, and Irene Marston, each seemed to tug in a different direction. Yet the thread that had snapped, revealing the true unraveling, was the resentful undercurrent beneath the village's polished veneer. She took up her knitting needles and began a slow, steady rhythm. As the wool looped and twisted, so did her thoughts. Why had Edmund allowed the dangerous fantasia to be played? Why had he not intervened sooner? Was it out of pride, jealousy, or something darker? And what of Eleanor Marston? Her quiet grief was tempered by flashes of anger that no one had dared address. Miss Marple's eyes rested on a scrap of paper, the original letter from Fenwick, warning George not to play the fantasia. The handwriting was jagged, urgent. Someone had ignored that warning. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Cheswick cottage, where Mrs. Durning greeted her with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I was hoping you might come back," she said softly. "There's something I should have told you before." They sat by the fire in the cozy sitting room, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and lavender. Mrs. Durning hesitated, then began. George Faulkner's breakdown wasn't just about the pressure of composing. It was about betrayal. Someone close to him took his work, altered it, and presented it as their own. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Do you know who?" Mrs. Durning swallowed. "Edmund Carlyle." The housekeeper's words were a quiet confession. "Irene found out too," she added. She confronted Edmund, begged him to stop. But he was obsessed, convinced he could finish what George had started. "And the fantasia, the dangerous music?" Miss Marple prompted. "It was Edmund's doing, yes. He added the frequencies. He thought it would prove his genius. But Irene feared it, said it was a weapon." Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling slowly into place. That evening, Miss Marple invited Eleanor Marston for tea. Eleanor arrived pale but composed, her eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said kindly. "I want you to know that I understand your pain and your anger." Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down her cup. "It's more than grief now. It's fear. Edmund has changed. I don't know who he is anymore. Do you think he intended harm to Irene?" "I'm not sure. But he never cared what the music did to her. He just wanted to be heard, to be remembered." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "There's still time to set things right." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "How?" "By telling the truth," Miss Marple said. "No matter how painful." Later that night, as the village lay under a thick blanket of fog, Miss Marple sat at her window. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with anticipation. She reflected on the threads she had pulled: betrayal, obsession, fear, and how they had come together in a tapestry of tragedy. Some melodies, she thought, are meant to be heard only once. Some secrets only uncovered by the patient hands of time. And sometimes the thread that snaps is the one that unravels the whole. The air in St. Petro's was crisp with the first hint of autumn as Miss Marple made her way along the narrow lane that led to the village hall. Leaves scuttled like restless whispers beneath her feet, and the sky above was a pale gray canvas, mottled with clouds that promised rain, but withheld it still. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though aware that the final act of this quiet tragedy was soon to unfold. Inside the hall, preparations were underway for a special gathering, one that would bring the villagers together to face the echoes of recent events and perhaps lay them to rest. Miss Marple, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, took her seat near the back, her eyes quietly scanning the room. The committee had arranged for a recital not of the Fantasia, but of a different piece, one composed by George Faulkner himself, a serene sonata set to express hope and renewal. It was to be performed by Eleanor Marston, who, despite the heavy burden she carried, had agreed to play. The event was both a tribute to Irene and a chance to reclaim music's healing power in a village, still scarred by its darker notes. As the clock chimed 7, the last of the villagers settled into their seats. Edmund Carlyle stood near the door, his expression shadowed and unreadable. Miss Marple caught his eye for a moment, and he gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible. The silence deepened when Eleanor took the stage, the pale gold of the spotlight catching the sheen of her dark hair. She seated herself at the grand piano, fingers poised lightly over the keys. For a moment, the room seemed to still, every breath held. Then the music began. The opening notes were delicate, weaving a tapestry of sound that seemed to wrap the room in a gentle embrace. Eleanor's playing was measured but filled with subtle emotion, a contrast to the tempestuous fantasia that had so unsettled the village. Miss Marple watched carefully, noting the slight tremor in Eleanor's hands and the way her eyes flickered toward Edmund now and then. The tension between them was a silent chord, as palpable as the music itself. Halfway through the sonata, a murmur rippled through the audience. The soft scrape of a chair, the faintest sigh. Miss Marple's eyes turned toward the back of the hall, where the door had opened quietly. Inspector Cray entered, nodding briefly to the vicar, who was seated in the front row. He moved with purpose to the side of the room, pulling a small leather satchel from his bag. The villagers exchanged curious glances, but the music flowed on, steady and sure. When the sonata concluded, Eleanor rose, a fragile smile touching her lips despite the tears that glistened in her eyes. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then growing warmer. Miss Marple stood, clapping softly, then cleared her throat to speak. "My dear friends," she began, her voice gentle but clear, "we have all been touched by sorrow these past weeks. But I believe that music, true music, is a language of the soul. It can reveal what words cannot and heal what pain has broken." She paused, allowing the words to settle. "Tonight, we honor not only Irene Marston, but all those who have suffered in silence. And we face the truth that has been hidden among us." A hush fell. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room before settling on Edmund Carlyle. "Edmund," she said softly, "you have shown great courage in coming forward and allowing your story to be heard. It takes strength to face the shadows we create." Edmund's eyes glistened. "I never wished to harm Irene. I thought the music would bring us together, not tear us apart." "No one here believes otherwise," Miss Marple replied. "But you must understand that genius, when untethered from compassion, can become a dangerous force." She turned toward Inspector Cray, the device that produced those hidden frequencies. It was the instrument of a man desperate to be recognized. But it is not merely the technology that must be judged, but the choices behind it. Cray stepped forward. "Edmund Carlyle will be assisting with the investigation as we determine the extent of the device's use and its consequences. For now, though, I ask the village to remember the power of forgiveness alongside justice." The congregation murmured assent, a tentative balm to the wounds that still bled beneath the surface. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered near the stage, approaching Eleanor. "You played beautifully," she said, placing a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "This night means more than I can say." Miss Marple nodded. "And now we await the last notes, the truth that will close this painful chapter." Outside, the wind stirred the amber leaves in a soft dance, as if nature itself was readying for a final bow. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fireside, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The tangled threads of ambition, fear, and longing that had woven the fabric of this mystery were slowly coming undone. The village of St. Petro's would never be quite the same, but in the quiet resilience of its people and in the healing power of honest music, there was hope. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, the rhythmic click of needles a comforting counterpoint to the silence. Some melodies end with a flourish, others fade into a whisper. And it is in those whispers that the truth often waits. The morning sun slipped cautiously through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting gentle shadows over the worn armchair and the small table where her knitting basket rested. Outside, the village of St. Petrox was stirring, though its usual brightness was tempered by a lingering chill, as if the events of recent weeks had left the very air hesitant to warm. Miss Marple sat quietly, eyes fixed on a small bundle of letters she had retrieved from her handbag. The delicate handwriting on the aged paper belonged to George Faulkner, penned decades ago, but suddenly vital again. The letters held secrets that reached far beyond the village and its present troubles, a reminder that the past often echoed louder than the present. As she unfolded one particular letter, a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Eleanor Marston, her face pale but composed. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Come in," Miss Marple said warmly, rising to greet her. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of tea. "I thought it best we speak. There's much I've yet to understand, and perhaps you can help." Miss Marple nodded, gesturing for Eleanor to sit beside her. "Tell me," she prompted gently. Eleanor sighed, eyes distant. George's music, his warnings, they weren't just about sound. They were about legacy, about the sins of those who came before. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the letter. "Go on. My father, Henry Marston, was close to George Faulkner in their youth. They shared a passion for composition, but also a fierce rivalry. When George's Fantasia was created, Henry feared its power and the darkness it might unleash." Eleanor's voice faltered. "Henry told me once that George's obsession with pushing boundaries almost destroyed him. He was a man haunted by his own creation." Miss Marple's mind raced. The threads were pulling taut. Did Henry Marston ever speak of anyone else involved? Anyone who might have exploited George's fears? Eleanor nodded slowly. There was a man, Simon Carlyle, a fellow composer and, some say, a rival to both George and Henry. He disappeared from the village years ago, but his shadow lingered. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Simon Carlyle. The name rings faint bells. A man with a penchant for secrecy, if I recall. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He was known for his experiments with sound, much like George, but darker. Some whispered he dabbled in dangerous frequencies, ones that could harm as well as heal." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "It seems this mystery runs deeper than we imagined, Eleanor. The Fantasia, the device, the tragedies, they are echoes of old rivalries and forgotten ambitions." Eleanor looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "So there's a way to end this? To silence the screams and restore peace?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "There is always a way, my dear, but it requires patience and courage." That afternoon, Miss Marple set out for the village archives, a small room nestled above the library. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old paper, a treasure trove for those seeking forgotten truths. She sifted through brittle newspapers and faded photographs, searching for any mention of Simon Carlyle. After an hour, she found what she sought, a yellowed clipping reporting the sudden disappearance of Carlyle in 1958, followed by rumors of scandal and secret experiments. A diary entry by George Faulkner was tucked nearby, its script urgent. "Simon's obsession grows. His experiments with frequency threaten to undo what we have built. If only I could warn the world." Miss Marple's fingers traced the words. The warning was clear but unheard. She leaned back, considering. Evening brought a chill and a gathering of villagers at the vicarage. The atmosphere was charged, a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Miss Marple took a moment to speak with Reverend Wells, whose steady presence had become a quiet comfort. "The past has a way of demanding reckoning, Reverend," she mused. "And sometimes the present must listen to those echoes before it can move forward." He nodded solemnly. "Indeed, Miss Marple. The village has been shaken, but perhaps now it can begin to heal." As the evening wore on, conversations shifted from suspicion to reflection. The villagers spoke of forgiveness, of lessons learned, and of the resilience of their community. Miss Marple remained thoughtful, knowing the final piece of the puzzle was near waiting to be uncovered, not in evidence, but in human hearts. The morning air in St. Petrox was unusually still, almost reverent, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple stood by the church gate, her pale blue coat buttoned neatly, her gloved hands resting over the handle of her umbrella. In front of her, the square was dappled in golden light, and the great chestnut tree beside the vicarage rustled softly in the breeze. She watched as Inspector Crail emerged from the path to the rectory, his face drawn but resolute. "You had something, I believe, you wished to say?" she asked, her voice gentle as ever. He nodded. "You were right, Miss Marple. About nearly everything, I suspect. We searched the attic space above George Faulkner's old studio this morning, just as you suggested. And we found the violin." Crail swallowed. "Broken. Its strings deliberately cut, bow warped by moisture. And behind it, wrapped in oilskin, a series of pages, sheet music. Variations on Faulkner's Fantasia, but altered. There were marginalia, too. In another hand, Simon Carlyle's, we believe." Miss Marple's eyes closed for a moment. "So he had continued George's work, or corrupted it?" "Corrupted," Crail agreed. "We've cross-checked with surviving documents in the Faulkner estate. Carlyle had taken George's experiments and weaponized them, twisting frequencies, embedding vibrations into compositions that could unsettle, even harm." "And you believe this was used?" Miss Marple asked softly. Crail hesitated. "We had the remnants of the mechanical device examined. There were traces of copper, quartz, and something else. Bone. Deliberate resonance chambers. Someone rebuilt the machine, but it wasn't George." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "It was someone who feared his legacy. Someone who wanted to finish what Simon Carlyle had started, or silence it forever." Crail looked uncertain. But who? Who among them had that kind of knowledge? Miss Marple looked down at the churchyard gravel, her expression far away. "Sometimes, Inspector, the question is not who had the knowledge, but who had the motive." By midday, the village had gathered at the rectory hall for the memorial service, ostensibly for George Faulkner, though grief, suspicion, and unanswered questions filled the air. Eleanor Marston sat near the front, head bowed, her gloved hand still. Nearby, Reverend Wells spoke quietly with Mrs. Finch. Young Arthur sat alone, pale and blinking, his eyes drifting toward the rafters where shadows trembled. Miss Marple arrived last, slipping into a side pew unnoticed. As the organist played a quiet lament, she scanned the crowd, her mind working swiftly. The final clue, as ever, had not been in a letter or a device, but in a single sentence spoken 2 evenings ago. He said the air was too thick with memory. Miss Marple rose. As the final hymn faded, she stepped forward, speaking not loudly, but clearly. "Before we part today," she said, her voice cutting softly through the hush, "I should like to say a few words, not about death, but about echoes." All eyes turned to her. "There are those," she began, "who believe that sound dies when silence begins. But any musician will tell you that's not quite true. A note lingers. It vibrates in the wood, the air, even in our bones. A pause. George Faulkner knew that. And so did someone else, someone who tried to manipulate those vibrations to destroy rather than inspire." The room shifted. Miss Marple turned to the small table at the front, where Faulkner's remaining possessions had been displayed. "The question is," she continued, "why would anyone want to sabotage George's reputation? Why go so far as to stage his death? With such drama, why destroy the violin that once gave him purpose?" A silence, tense and listening. She looked at Eleanor. "You said your father warned you about the Fantasia's power." Eleanor nodded slowly, uncertain. "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "he also preserved every scrap of its history. He kept George's letters. He encouraged you to learn music, even helped you catalog the Faulkner archive after George's return." Eleanor blinked. "Yes, he said the past needed caretakers." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet there was another caretaker, one who did not wish the Fantasia to be remembered, but buried." She turned. "Mrs. Finch." All heads turned. Mrs. Finch stiffened. I beg your pardon." "You told me once you'd been Faulkner's housekeeper before the war," Miss Marple said. "But you weren't merely a housekeeper, were you?" The woman's face had drained of color. "You were his assistant, his apprentice, even. You had access to his notes, his instruments, his experiments." "That's nonsense," she said sharply. "And yet you knew the device's function," Miss Marple said softly. "I saw it in the way you flinched when I mentioned resonance. The way you glanced at the library when we heard the violin. You knew exactly what had been rebuilt because you helped build it once." Crail stepped forward. Mrs. Finch rose to her feet, trembling. It was dangerous, she whispered. All of it. George, he didn't understand what he'd done. He thought he was unlocking beauty, but it was madness. Simon twisted him, and I saw it happen. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. And so you tried to stop it. Years later, when George returned, you feared he would revive Carlyle's vision, that the Fantasia would be performed again. Mrs. Finch's eyes shone with tears. He was talking of opening the studio, of playing again. I knew I had to stop it. I rebuilt the old device not to harm, but to frighten, to make him stop. But then he found it. And destroyed the violin, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Finch nodded. He was furious, said I'd betrayed him. We argued. He stormed out, and the next morning, he was gone. The silence in the room was absolute. Creo stepped forward, again placing a hand gently on Mrs. Finch's arm. There was no murder, Miss Marple said quietly. Only fear, grief, and long-held guilt. Eleanor looked down, face pale. Mrs. Finch's voice trembled. I only wanted to protect him and the village. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Sometimes protection becomes possession, and fear becomes tragedy. Later, as the sun dipped, behind the hills, Miss Marple sat in her garden, sipping tea. Creel joined her, fatigue in his posture. We'll keep it quiet, he said. The official report will say George Faulkner died of a heart condition. That's not far from the truth, I suppose. No, Miss Marple said softly. Not far at all. He looked at her. You knew from the beginning, didn't you? I suspected, she replied. Not the method, but the emotion. People rarely kill for clever reasons. They kill for love or fear or shame. He stood to leave, then paused. Do you believe the Fantasia was dangerous? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Music is never dangerous, Inspector. But people often are. And with that, she returned to her knitting, the final note of the mystery fading into the dusk lingering only in memory. The end.